Hi there, and welcome to this third in a series of short videos about thesis statements in academic writing. My name is Dr. Ted Remington. I am Associate Professor of English at the University of St. Francis in Fort Wayne, Indiana. In this video, we will look at some of the kinds of poor thesis statements that we saw in video number 2 and look at the examples that we saw in that video and then remake them, refashion them into thesis statements that actually work. So we'll have a chance to revisit the problems that we saw and correct them. Now, you may remember this one. Healthcare costs in this country are rising. We use that as an example of a statement of fact, not an opinion. That, remember, is job one of a thesis statement is to be an opinion. And this is simply a fact. But we could remake this into a thesis statement that actually works. And one way of the infinite ways you could do this, number of ways you could do this, is by saying the dramatic increase in healthcare costs over the last decade suggests that a national single-payer insurance program for all Americans is needed. Notice how this takes that simple statement of fact and then changes it into an opinion, and not only an opinion, but a specific opinion, and one that you can imagine people disagreeing with. We also looked at what we called wishy-washy thesis statements, ones where it seems like the author kind of put in a lot of trap doors for a quick escape from their position if they're challenged on it. And the example that we looked at was it might be possible that new legislation could help improve the conditions in nursing homes. At least that was one of the examples we looked at. And you see there's a lot of qualifying language in it, but if we took that out and made it more specific, we could have a much more effective thesis statement, like passing federal laws mandating a minimum nurse-to-patient ratio in nursing homes will lead to a dramatic improvement in the quality of life of patients. Notice how we've gotten rid of all that qualifying language of might and could, and we've also made the thesis more specific. This is going to be a recurring theme. If rule 1 of thesis statements is to state an opinion, not simply a fact, rule 2, almost as important, is that a thesis statement, if it's going to be good, should be as specific as possible. We also talked about thesis statements. That is, thesis statements that stated an opinion, but an opinion that was so already accepted that it doesn't really work for a thesis statement for an actual academic argument. One of the examples we looked at was this. The Holocaust was a tragic episode in European history. No one in their right mind would disagree with that, so it doesn't really make for a very good thesis. You're not adding anything to the conversation about that event by stating that opinion. But you could still take that basic topic and turn it into a good thesis statement. And again, there's a gazillion ways you could do that. One of them might be something like this. The seeds of the Holocaust were planted at the end of World War I. The mistakes made in drafting the Treaty of Versailles ensured the rise of fascism in the defeated Germany. Noticed how we've now made a much more specific claim, and one that you can imagine people disagreeing with. There may be people who don't think that the way World War I ended directly led to the Holocaust, or if it played a role, it was a minor role, etc. There's a number of ways in which people might not necessarily agree with that. It's because it's a much more specific and a much more kind of debatable thesis. And that's what you want. You don't want to state something that everyone is already going to agree with. Because as I said earlier, if you state something that everyone agrees with, why write the paper to begin with? And as we just mentioned, one of the best things you can do to make your thesis better is to be specific. And in all 3 cases that we've looked at so far, all of them, in addition to getting rid of the mistake that we've talked about, being too factual, being wishy-washy, they've gotten more specific. And here we're looking exactly at that issue. When we talked about hazy thesis statements, you may remember that one of the examples we looked at was this. We need to rethink how we train K-12 instructors to meet the needs of today's students. And we said, okay, that sounds kind of good, but there's nothing really specific in there. We're not sure who we is. We don't know what kind of rethinking we need to do. It's all kind of vague, even though it sounds like it's getting there. So by making it more specific, we can make this thesis much, much better. Something like, while some might object that teachers cannot and should not be social workers, it is important that teachers in training receive more instruction in child psychology than they currently receive. Notice that now we've said something specific about what kind of retraining or training that teachers need to meet the needs of today's students. So that's a much better way of writing a thesis about that same general topic. Lastly, you may remember that we looked at thesis statements on the complete other side of the spectrum, ones that we said screamed, that is, thesis statements that simply got in our face and said, this is right, you're wrong if you don't think it already. So one example that we looked at was, the invasion of Iraq was justified, and anyone who doubts that is an idiot or a traitor. Well, we can make that basic thesis much, much better by dialing it down a few notches, and again, as always, making it more specific. So something like, although mistakes were made in the planning and execution of the invasion of Iraq, it will prove to be worth the cost in the long term because of the increased influence the U.S. will have in the Middle East. Notice that again takes on the same topic, that hasn't changed, but now we've made a more specific claim, and we've made that specific claim in a way that is basically polite and shows just sort of good conversational manners with our reader. And that's what you want, because again, academic writing is essentially your chance to participate in a conversation. And just like in a conversation you might have with friends, if someone gets in your face and yells at you, that's going to make you defensive and not want to listen to that person. If you want someone to listen to you, you need to treat them like an equal and not assume that they already agree with you, and that if they don't, then there's something wrong with them. So those are just some examples of how you could take any one of the 5 problematic kinds of thesis statements or pseudo-thesis statements that we looked at in the previous video and remake them to give them a makeover and make them actually effective thesis statements. In the next video, we'll continue this and we'll make it a little bit more interactive by letting you have a chance to guess at whether a thesis statement is good or not so good.